Hi, and welcome back to another episode of ADK Talks. This is Jane. Unfortunately, Steve's not with us today, but we have a really fantastic guest. What if one of the Northeast's most exceptional art museums wasn't in New York City or Boston, but right here in the foothills of the Adirondacks? Today on the podcast, we're heading to Glens Falls, New York to explore the Hyde Collection, an intimate boutique museum where old masters, modern icons, and deeply human stories coexist. Our guest today is Bryn Schockmel, curator of the permanent collection and related exhibitions at the Hyde, and the person who helps decide what hangs on the walls, what travels the world, and how visitors experience this extraordinary place. Bryn, welcome to ADK Talks.
Thank you so much for having me.
I'm so excited about this. Actually, when we first started this podcast, this was on the top of my list of places that we wanted to feature. So I'm glad that we could finally make it work. Before we dive in, can you give us a bit of context about the Hyde Collection? It exists because of two people, Louis and Charlotte Hyde, who were deeply rooted in Glens Falls. Louis was a successful businessman, and Charlotte was a passionate and curious collector at a time when few women shaped cultural institutions so boldly. Talk a little bit about how you would describe Louis and Charlotte, not just as collectors, but also, as people who shaped what the museum looks like today.
Well, they were very rooted here in Glens Falls because Charlotte's father, Samuel Prine, was the co-founder of the Finch Prine paper mill, which is still located right behind the museum. And so the family's wealth came from that paper mill. And Louis Hyde then worked at the paper mill as a vice president. And that's where sort of the family's money came from and where their connection to the town came from. And so after the couple met in Boston, they settled here, they got married, they built their house here right next to Charlotte's sister. Her sister Mary had already built a home here. And as soon as they sort of finished building their house in 1912, they began collecting. And I think what makes them stand apart as collectors is that they didn't have sort of a checklist. They weren't saying, well, we want to have one of this and one of that. They weren't trying to tell a complete history of art. They were just collecting things that they were passionate about, that they liked, that they wanted to live with. And so I think that's what makes it feel special. When you walk around, you're seeing paintings and chairs and tapestries and things that were personal to them, that they had sort of that connection to.
The first time I was there, I think I was in high school, and I was like, wow, you get the sense that you really do get the sense of the home. But I'm just like, what was it like to live amongst these amazing pieces of art? What surprises people most when they walk into the Hyde for the first time?
I think what surprises people is that it does feel like a home. It's a large home, but it's not a palace. It does still have a sort of lived-in feel to it. The dining room, the table seats 4 people. The bedrooms are, comfortable-sized bedrooms. So it feels like a family home. You get a sense that people lived there, that they sat in these chairs, that they read these books, that they slept in these beds, and they had this amazing art on the walls.
The Hyde is sometimes compared to the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in Boston. Do you think that's a fair comparison?
I do think so. So Charlotte and Louis, they met in Boston. They were familiar with the Gardner and Isabella's collection. And Isabella's museum is also this sort of Italian Renaissance-style home with the garden in the middle. And that's the look that the Hydes were going for when they built their home. Most of the other houses in sort of Glens Falls and Saratoga in the early 1900s were in that Victorian style, very decorative, very ornate. But their home is somewhat more simple, and it's just all the rooms look out on this beautiful courtyard with all of the plants and lots of light. So I think there are similarities there in the house and also in terms of the sort of art that they were collecting. Isabella has a lot of Renaissance and Baroque art, and that's sort of the same with Charlotte, the things that she tended towards.
Yeah, she was also, an advocate for art education, access, and community. And how does that guide the Hyde today?
Oh, very much so. So education was really important to Charlotte early on. She opened up the space for visitors to come for tours, to take drawing classes in the courtyard. And that's still so important to us today. We have a really robust program of educational programs for all ages, for little kids, for students, for adults, for families. We have art making activities, tours, lectures, screenings, just all kinds of stuff constantly going on. And it connects to our exhibition. So it ties back with the art that you're going to see on the walls. So you go to one of our shows and you see some still lifes, and then maybe you do a still life class in the classroom.
Yeah, I've attended some of your events. They're really interesting, and I've done some of those. In fact, I did one with you back in 2024 when you had the exhibit about Venetian visions, which was incredible. How does the museum balance honoring the Hyde's vision and also evolving for contemporary audiences?
I think we've certainly expanded our collection of modern and contemporary art over the last decade or two. Charlotte and Louis tended to collect mostly more historical works of art. They collected a few things from the early 20th century, like we have an amazing painting by Picasso, but they weren't collecting a lot of like contemporary artists working in like the 50s, for example. And so that collection, our modern and contemporary collection, has really grown over the last decade. We built a new gallery that's dedicated just to contemporary art. And my colleague Durin Tanyel, who's our curator of modern contemporary, she does a wonderful array of shows of artists that are living or artists that were working in the 20th century. And we often try to, sometimes we'll have a complementary schedule of exhibitions where they all kind of flow together. And sometimes we'll have things that are really different. And so you'll see, historic furniture in one gallery, and then you'll see these very contemporary abstract paintings in another gallery. And that's intentional because not everybody likes the same things. We want people to be able to come to the Hyde and experience different kinds of art and maybe discover something new that they didn't know they liked before, but now they do. And I think Charlotte and Louis would approve of that because for them, the museum was so much about the community and welcoming people in. And I think they would want visitors to experience different things.
So even when they were living in the home, they invited people in to see their collection. That's amazing.
Yes. So in the last decade or two of Charlotte's life, after her husband had died, she started opening it up to tours for the public and doing drawing classes and things like that. She very much had a vision in her mind that she wanted this to be a museum.
She outlived him by several decades, correct?
Yeah, by about 30 years.
And she really dug deep into collecting, and not that she wasn't doing it while he was still living, but that really became her passion. Is that right?
Very much so. And she actually had a curator. She had a couple of curators during her lifetime, but one who was with her for about 20 years, Jerry Dodge, and he helped sort of shape her collection. He was the one who really encouraged her to buy the Picasso because even though it wasn't so much to Charlotte's taste, Dodge was like, you need to sort of keep up with the times. So he was very encouraging, and she worked with a lot of other professionals. She had connections with galleries. She would travel to Europe, go to New York City. So she was very much always kind of on the lookout for something that would be a good addition to her collection.
That's awesome. Are visitors surprised to find these major works of art in Glens Falls, New York?
I think so. We often hear from people that they had no idea that this was here and that, we have a Rembrandt and a Rubens and a Botticelli and all of these like really amazing sort of A-plus artists. And it's just, in this relatively small city in upstate New York. And so I do think visitors are surprised, or sometimes they'll say, like you mentioned beforehand, that, they had come as a school tour when they were younger and now they're finally coming back as an adult or maybe bringing their own children. So that's always wonderful.
How do you help visitors? Because as you talked about earlier, it's not New York, it's not Boston, it's not an art destination. So how do you help people, especially those who maybe don't consider themselves, as art people? And our listener, you can't see me, I'm making air quotes around art people. But how do you help them connect emotionally with these works?
I would always encourage people to take one of the tours if they're here on a time that a tour is being offered. We have a really dedicated and wonderful team of docents who give tours, and then occasionally myself and other members of the staff give tours. And I think I find this for myself also when I visit museums. Sometimes it helps to hear from someone else, to hear why they're so passionate about something, to hear from them what the story is, because it helps make it come alive. And so particularly if you're visiting for the first time to, take one of those guided tours of the house, or if that's not your preference, we also have booklets and audio guides. If you'd rather kind of go at your own pace, you can do that. And then I think it's also important to just sort of slow down and to really stop and look at some of the things. If something really strikes you, just take a moment and look at it. And it's lovely that we're a not so large and busy museum, because sometimes when you go to the Gardner or the Met or the MFA, you can't stop and look at that painting because there's so many people around it. But here you can just sort of take a moment and have a time with a work that really speaks to you.
Right. And I find it's the right size. When you go to bigger museums, especially when I lived in New York, I would go to the Met regularly, but I would go and see just one thing because otherwise it was like too overwhelming, all the art.
It's overwhelming, yeah.
Are all of your tours, where can people find out about that? On your website?
Everything's on the website, yeah. So if you go to the website, and we've got a page with all of our events, and you can see the times of tours, of the art making classes, other things like that are all on there.
Please give our listeners the URL for your website.
It is hydecollection.org.
Awesome. And I would encourage people, not just to look up the tours and what kind of events are going on, but there's beautiful pictures and photography there, and you can really get a sense of the collection on the website.
Yeah, you can search the collection, read about different works in the collection, all sorts of things.
Fantastic. I want to pivot now about a current exhibit. So we mentioned earlier that you guys don't just have the Hyde's personal collection on exhibit, you also bring in exhibits. And currently a Feast of Fruit and Flowers, which is of women painters, women still life painters of the 17th century and beyond. Tell us a little bit about that exhibit, because I know it's near and dear to your heart.
Yes, this has been a real passion project of mine. I've been researching women artists, and particularly historical women artists, for many years now. And when I started working at the Hyde, just about 3 years ago now, I really wanted to do an exhibition focused on women artists. And I was thinking about what could be sort of my focus. And I decided to look at women still life painters, because still life, which is, a painting of fruit or flowers or really anything that's not humans and animals. Still life paintings, they existed in antiquity. We have examples that survive from Pompeii, for instance, but then they kind of disappeared during the Renaissance. And right around the year 1600, across Europe, a bunch of artists started making still lifes, which were a new thing. And women were so much at the forefront of this new genre. They helped really create this new subject of still life paintings. And no one had ever explored that before in a museum exhibition. And so I thought it would be an interesting topic for us to do here.
Tell us about some of the works that people might see in the exhibit.
We have a fantastic collection of works in the exhibition. They're all borrowed from across the country. None of them are actually from our permanent collection. We've borrowed works from the National Gallery in D.C., from Houston, from California, from Massachusetts and New York. And it's some of really the big names of women painters of this time, of the 1600s. So it starts off with two of the really early artists, Clara Peters and Fede Galizia. Clara Peters' painting is this really incredible image with lobster and crab and all of the seafood. And then the Fede Galizia is fruit and a big melon. And then we have a painting by Rachel Rausch, who she was working later in the 1600s. And she was really interested in sort of getting everything, all the details exactly right. Like when you look at her flowers, when you look at her butterflies, if you're knowledgeable about these things, you can tell exactly what species they are. And another artist that we have that I think is very interesting. Her name is Maria Sibylla Marion, and she was a botanist and an entomologist, and she actually spent 2 years in South America studying all the animals there and the flora and fauna, and published a big book. And she was really the first person to understand the life cycle of caterpillar to butterfly. And so she made these amazing contributions into the field of natural science as well into art history. So it's a diverse collection of artists, but at the same time, they all have very similar themes and subject matters. And it's a lot of artists that people probably won't be familiar with. Many of them I didn't know until I started studying this. And so I think visitors will get a chance to see something new and different.
Oh, that's really special. How long was this exhibit in the making?
A long time. So exhibitions take a while to put together. And so I spent a few years just sort of researching the topic and learning about women and learning about still lifes. And then about 2 years before the show opened, we started sort of sending out our formal loan requests and asking museums if we could borrow these paintings. And at the same time, I was working on the catalog. We published a catalog that goes along with this exhibition. So start to finish, just sort of the the process of putting it all together 2+ years.
Oh, wow. I remember when I was on the tour with you about the Venetian exhibit, you talking about this, and it was so surprising to me how long it takes. In 2 years, I think you said is not that's kind of the average. It's sometimes much, much longer.
Yeah. Or even on the short side, some exhibitions can take even longer.
How does the process of sharing art work? I mean, you must have to build relationships with these museums over time. How does that work?
Well, sharing the art is so important because it would get sort of boring if every time you went to a museum, you were only seeing the same things over and over again. And so in order for us to do exhibitions, we have to borrow things from our colleagues. And since starting here at the Hyde, we've developed some really close relationships with a lot of the more regional museums. And so we've got a great relationship with the Fenimore Museum in Cooperstown. We've borrowed some pieces from the Clark, from Vassar, from MFA Boston. And then for this show, the Feast of Fruit and Flowers, we were looking much further afield. And it was great to sort of start developing some relationships with museums in DC, for example, with the National Gallery and the National Museum of Women in the Arts. And it's reciprocal. And so we also lend some of our works as well. And so occasionally you might come to the museum and one of your favorite paintings isn't here. And that's because it's on the road somewhere and we've lent it to someone for their exhibition. So I do think it's important that we develop those relationships, and especially regionally. It's nice when we can lend things to sort of our local partners.
You guys also lend globally, because I think you told a story about how you got to accompany a piece of art. Can you it was fascinating to me. So can you retell that?
Yes, of course. So we do occasionally lend things internationally as well. And a few years ago, in 2023, we lent one of our really lovely paintings by an artist named Ong. It's a small work of Paolo and Francesca, so it's a story from Dante. And we lent it to a museum in France that was doing a whole exhibition on Ong and these paintings. The museum's in the city of Chantilly. And when we lend paintings, we, especially internationally, a member of the curatorial team travels with the painting as a courier because, we want to keep an eye on it. And what if there's a snowstorm and the plane gets diverted to Iceland? We want to make sure that someone is with that painting the whole time. And it travels in a very fancy custom-made crate that's climate controlled and shock resistant and all of those things.
It's not going into the overhead.
It is not going into the overhead. And so I did the sort of pickup of the painting. And so I flew to France and then went to Chantilly, and I got to watch them take it off the wall and pack it up into the crate. And then I rode with the truck to Charles de Gaulle, where it got locked into a room overnight. And then I got picked up from my hotel very early the next morning, and we went to Charles de Gaulle and we got it. And it was very cool getting to go in the sort of cargo hold area of Charles de Gaulle and watch them, wrap the painting up and put it on the pallet and put it on the plane. And then it was the only time in my life I've flown first class on a plane. So that was amazing. And then we kind of did the whole process in reverse when we got to JFK, and I saw it come off the pallet and then rode the truck ride back to New York. And it was a great experience. And it's something that, when this happens, the borrowing museum covers all the costs. So this did not cost the Hyde any money, but we gained from it a lot of great sort of publicity, because when people went to France and saw this exhibition and read the label or read the catalog, they'd see, oh, this painting's from the Hyde Collection in Glens Falls. I wonder what that is. And maybe some of them would come visit us.
I just want to go back to something. Why does it take so long to put on an exhibit?
Well, in some ways, we're still a little bit old-fashioned in that we do quite a lot of things by paper. And so when I'm sending a request to a museum to ask them to borrow a painting, I write a long letter, which I then print out and put in an envelope and mail.
How novel.
And and then the review process takes a while. So once that museum receives my request, the curatorial staff reviews it, the registrar, the conservator, then it has to go before their committee and get voted on by the board. And that whole process can take several months. And then they might write back to me and say no. And sometimes they have a very good reason for saying no. The painting's too old and too fragile and it wouldn't be safe for it to travel, or we've already promised it for another exhibition, that sort of thing. But then if I wait 3 months and get a no, then I have to go sort of my second choice on the list and send out another letter and start the whole process all over again. So there's all of those steps. And then once we have what we call the checklist in place, our sort of final list of what's going to be in the exhibition, then my colleague Rachel, who's our registrar and collections manager, she kind of takes over the process, and she deals with sort of getting all the crates built. All of these paintings need custom crates, and that can take a long time to get built. And then she has to arrange for the shipping, and how are they going to get here, and what's the insurance, and are those museums sending a courier, and we need to book them a hotel, and et cetera, et cetera. So there's quite a lot of logistics that goes on with it.
Yeah, I can imagine. And I can totally understand why it would be paper-based, because I don't know if I were, the Museum of Fine Arts in Houston, if I got an email from Glens Falls, New York, it'd be like an email from a Nigerian prince asking for money. So that's sort of, I think that totally makes sense to me. I'm eager to know what led you to curatorial work. What brought you to Glens Falls?
I've known this is what I wanted to do for my career since I was in high school. I have always loved visiting museums. And when I first kind of discovered that this career existed as a curator, I was like, oh, that's what I want to do. And so I actually went to Skidmore College for undergrad. So I was in the area. And then I went away for grad school to the Courtauld in London, and then Boston University. And all along the way, I was having sort of part-time jobs and internships working in different museum departments. So I did some work in education. I had one of my first jobs was working in a museum shop. But then I also was doing curatorial work. And that's what really was my passion and what I was most interested in. And after I finished grad school, I moved to Oklahoma City, and I had a fellowship at the Oklahoma City Museum of Art, which then turned into a curatorial position, a job there. And OKC was a great place. I loved living there, and it was a perfect sort of first full-time job, really kind of learning the ropes and getting some museum experience. And then I came back to this area and started working here at the Hyde in beginning of 2023.
Stephen and I are famous for our tangents in our episodes, but I lived in Kansas City for a little while. And, I think it's really important, if you're from either coast, to spend a little time in the Midwest. They're very derisively called the flyover states, and they shouldn't be.
Agree.
But there's tremendous art. Kansas City has some tremendous art. Oklahoma City has great art. Tulsa has great art. So I think it just really opened my eyes to how much culture there is outside of, the Chicago, New York, Boston, LA kind of thing.
Well, you've got the Nelson Atkins Museum in Kansas City. It's one of my favorites. And I think it's only about a 5-hour drive from OKC. So I went there quite a lot.
Yeah, the Nelson, and there's a great contemporary art museum, the Kemper.
Yes.
Yeah, I loved that. And the Kansas City Art Institute is one of the top art schools in the country. So, okay, tangent over. So I'm fascinated about this, women in still life painters. I can't wait to pop in and see that. What other upcoming exhibitions or programs are you excited about?
We have a full slate of things coming up in 2026. This summer, our sort of big show in the main gallery is called Wings and Wilderness, Birds and Landscapes of the Northeast. That opens on June 6th, and it's going to be a combination of works from our permanent collection. We have a really rich collection of Adirondack and sort of Northeast landscapes, so paintings of Lake George, the Adirondacks, but also sort of Massachusetts and surrounding areas. So those paintings paired with works of bird art that are being lent to us from the Museum of American Bird Art at Mass Audubon. And this came together. We were talking about how these connections are so important. One of my colleagues from Boston University is now the director of the Museum of American Bird Art, and they're currently closed while they're building a new building. And so this seemed like the perfect time for us to collaborate. And so they're lending us a number of the really wonderful works in their collection, which we're going to pair with our landscapes. So we'll have sort of the birds of the Northeast and the landscapes of the Northeast. So that's this summer. And then also happening this spring, summer, my colleague Bryn is doing an exhibition on Toshiko Takeizu, who is a ceramic artist. And so there'll be a number of small and large ceramic pieces paired with works from our modern and contemporary collection. So that'll be in our Fibes and Schmidt gallery. And then in the fall, we've got even more coming. So in the fall, I'm doing an exhibition on Shaker art.
Oh, interesting.
And Shaker furniture and design. One of my early jobs was working at a Shaker museum. It's something I've always been really interested in. So we're borrowing some pieces from some private collectors, actually. I'm going to be showing some really beautiful Shaker furniture And then in our wood gallery, we have an exhibition on Scandinavian art and design from sort of the late 19th and early 20th century. And that's a show that's been organized by the Frick in Pittsburgh. And they're traveling that show to a few different venues. So it's going to be coming here, sort of fall 26 into winter 27. So all sorts of great things coming up. And you can find the dates and the details on the website.
That's great. HydeCollection.org.
Yes.
I just want to touch on something briefly because we've talked about having Bryn on the podcast to talk about the Fibus and Schmidt collection, which is incredible and really expanded your or the Hyde's collection into modern art. Can you just tell our listeners just a little bit about that?
So about a decade or so ago, we received this very generous gift from Fibus and Schmidt, who were two architects, and they collected a lot of the big names of sort of 20th century art that were really kind of missing from our collection. So people like Bridget Riley and Ellsworth Kelly, and we now incorporate those works of art into some of our exhibitions. Bryn does exhibitions that she'll include these works in, and sometimes we just showcase them on their own. So we will be doing in 2027, we're going to be doing a 10-year anniversary retrospective exhibition that'll be looking at some of these real highlights from the Fibus and Schmidt collection.
And just anecdotally, Fibus and Schmidt were architects in Schenectady, New York. So again, somebody in not what you would expect to be a big art scene. We're collecting these incredible works of art. In fact, my parents knew them. And at one point, my mother mentioned, I can't remember if it was to Fibus or Schmidt, that's their last names, listener, that she was a big fan of Frank Lloyd Wright. And they had chairs that Frank Lloyd Wright designed and kept in his suite at the Plaza when he was building the Guggenheim. And they invited my parents over so my mom could sit in one of the chairs, which I think is a really cool story.
That's very cool. It is amazing, as I've been working here, how many collectors there are in the area. We last year we had an exhibition of works from the Georgie collection, which is it's in Shushan, New York, and they just collected all these amazing Renaissance paintings that I had no idea they were there, and they had them in their fishing lodge. And so we borrowed some of those paintings while they were renovating their space. And so it's been nice meeting some of the private collectors and the people in the area and having a chance to showcase some of their art as well.
For somebody who's never been to the Hyde, is there something that they should not miss on their first visit, or they should do when they get there?
Well, I definitely have a few paintings that I think you should not miss. Really, on your first visit, you should just make sure you see the whole house, go in every single room, but you absolutely have to see the Rembrandt in the library, which I think is probably our most famous painting, and then the Picasso in Charlotte's bedroom, and then the Botticelli in the music room, which is slightly smaller, so I suppose you might walk by it and not see it, but make sure you take a pause and look at the Botticelli, because that's really one of our great paintings as well.
Is there a specific time of year that's ideal to visit the Hyde?
I would say come at any time of year. You can look at the website to see maybe what exhibitions are of interest to you and plan your visit around that. But, Glens Falls is a great city all year round. And so you can come to the Hyde and then you can go out to lunch and just have a nice day here.
And for those of you, a lot of our listeners are not from New York. If you're planning a visit to the Adirondacks, Glens Falls is in the sort of the southern foothills of the Adirondacks. It's about, I don't know, what would you say, an hour north of Albany? Steve's usually my GPS and tells me where everything is because I'm a horrible at direction. But Glens Falls is about an hour north of Albany. It's maybe 20 minutes south of Lake George, Bold Landing and Lake George Village.
We're kind of halfway between Lake George and Saratoga.
So if you're up here, especially if you're up here in the winter and you're planning to ski or you're with people that are skiing and you don't ski or snowboard or snowmobile, it's a great place to go on a Saturday afternoon. So it's a great thing to do on a rainy day in the summer and a great thing to do any day.
Yes.
All right, Bryn. So this has been super fascinating. I've learned more about the Hyde, and I'm sure there's a lot more to learn. But before we release you into the wild, when you're not at the museum, do you have a favorite hidden gem? We always ask our guests this. It's I think a way our listeners love to get an insider's perspective on some of the best places or maybe things they might not know about in the Adirondacks. And it could be anything. People have mentioned ice cream stands. They've mentioned trails, paddles, movie theaters. It can be other museums like the Adirondack Experience. It could be anything. You just can't say the Hyde.
Okay, I won't say the Hyde. Well, I mean, we do have lots of great restaurants here in Glens Falls. I'm always trying new places to eat. But since I am a museum person, I will say a museum. So last summer, I went up to Lake Placid, which I'd been to before as a kid, but this was my first time visiting the Olympic Museum, and it was fantastic. I don't know if it's really a hidden gem, but I had never been there before, and I thought it was really interesting learning about kind of the history of the Olympics and particularly the Winter Olympics. And since we have a Winter Olympics coming up in just a few weeks, I feel like it would be a timely time to go visit it.
I love that. I actually have not been there. My nephew was there last summer and raved about it too. So I think I've got to check that out. Thank you for that. Well, Bryn, thank you so much for spending time with us. Listener, again, we encourage you to visit their website, check out, find an exhibit you might want to see, or just go for the first time and dip your toe in and see what this amazing institution in the Southern Adirondacks has to offer.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Bryn. Have a great day.
You too.
Wow. You know, this conversation is a reminder that some of the Northeast's most meaningful cultural experiences aren't found in the big cities, but in places where passion, place, and people intersect. And, you know, Bryn touched on this. Glens Falls is actually going, I think, in the last couple of years, has really gone through a revival. As she mentioned, there's some great restaurants in Glens Falls. There's good shopping. There's a great performing arts theater there. So it's definitely, you know, worth a stop on your way driving into the Adirondacks or leaving. It's a great place to stop. Listener, thanks again for joining us. Please visit our website, adktaste.com, and subscribe to our newsletter so you never miss an insight. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate and review us. It really helps ADK Talks be more discoverable for other people looking for insights and information about the amazing 6 million acre Adirondack Park. Until next time, take care, and we'll see you on the pod. Bye-bye.